Is real.
When your cameras roll, our experts react.
Jaw-dropping.
Weather Gone Viral, Sunday nights at 9, here on the Weather Channel.
Know your evacuation zones and make those store runs right now. The clock is ticking for Hurricane Delta to make landfall on the Gulf Coast. Places affected by Laura are among the cities in the cone yet again. Hurricane hunters are currently flying in the storm and collecting data to help us warn you about the dangers of this storm. We also have live team coverage up and down the Gulf Coast as this Category 2 hurricane gets closer by the hour. Mike?
Hey, Jackie, welcome back to Morgan City, Louisiana. Coming up, we'll talk to Tim Matt and talk to him about the levee system, the seawall, what they're concerned with as Hurricane Delta makes landfall sometime on Friday, likely not far west of here. Jackie?
All right, Mike, thanks so much, and thanks for being with us for our continuing coverage of Hurricane Delta. I'm meteorologist Jackie Jarris. We've got storm specialist Carl Parker. He's going to join us in just a second. But Delta, it is now forecast to be the 10th storm to hit the U.S. this year. That will be a record. It's also the 25th named storm this season. We want to get you caught up with what we know right now. The governors of Louisiana and Alabama have declared a state of emergency. There are mandatory evacuations of tourists underway on the Alabama coast. There have also been evacuations on 56 platforms and one offshore oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. And in Louisiana, some school districts are now closed through Friday. So let's get the latest on Delta with our storm specialist, Carl Parker. And Carl, Delta back over the open waters.
Yeah, that's right. And the hurricane hunters have been out in the system, and what they're finding so far has not been all that impressive. They're looking at winds that have just barely into hurricane force range. Right now, officially a Category 2 with 100-mile-per-hour winds. Going to be really interesting to see what the hurricane hunters will want to do with the system next, because again, so far they have not found very strong winds. This has always been a storm with a smaller core, and smaller cores are more susceptible to changes in the environment. They can also ramp up very quickly, which is why we saw a 145-mile-per-hour Category 4 storm yesterday. It just shot up with that very tiny little core, only 4 miles across. That eye was 4 miles across. But also because it was undergoing some shear yesterday, it started to weaken, and now you got the interaction with land. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what the hurricane hunters find as they continue to do a sort of crisscross pattern across that storm, if they continue to see these lower readings in intensity, because that certainly could have a downstream effect. This is the forecast as it stands right now, but this is based on the storm being a 100-mile-per-hour storm right now. If it is something weaker than that, then that is going to have an effect on all of these values going downstream and right up until the point where it makes landfall. So we can certainly hope for that. There is going to be plenty of time for the system to get its act together. It's going to be out over the open water of the Gulf of Mexico, and so for that reason, we think it still does present a very serious threat. Hurricane watch is in effect across much of southern Louisiana, including Lafayette and Lake Charles. It may run up and in between those areas, but also well to the east into Morgan City. We think it's going to be a larger circulation as it's coming in, so those strong winds affecting a very broad area. And that storm surge threat as well, and the worst of it may be around Vermilion Bay, maybe as much as 7 to 11 feet of surge there. So it's going to be sitting out over very warm water. It's going to be in an optimal position in terms of the winds, lighter winds generally in the western Gulf. That will change as the storm gets closer. The winds will increase, the wind shear will increase. That is not optimal. And then also the water temperatures are going to decrease. So wherever it stands, wherever it's going to be sitting in terms of intensity over the next couple of days, it's likely going to begin to decline right as it's approaching. So we can hope for that as well. We can hope that that brings down the wind speeds, but because it will be a large circulation, it may still bring in quite a bit of storm surge, and that is going to be a big threat, we think, from this storm. Jackie, over to you.
All right, Carl, stand by because I want to talk to you more about those intensity changes. But first, I want to show you some new video into the Weather Channel. No sooner did Delta move away from the Yucatan Peninsula than did crews start getting out to survey the damage and start cleaning up. Here you can see see them removing some tree debris in this new video, and it's a little bumpy video. You can really hear the wind still blowing there. The winds did snap some trees. It peeled away some roofs here and knocked down some power lines as it roared ashore in the popular tourist destination here in Mexico. So the eye of Delta has also been very small, and you get a bit of an idea of just how small it was from this video from the hurricane hunters as they flew through Delta yesterday. More missions are set for today. One is in progress right now, and another takes off in just another couple of hours. So this mission and the information that we get from the hurricane hunters, Carl, so important because that's a better way to give us an idea of just how intense the storm is. Generally, the lower the pressure, the stronger the winds. But this has really kind of been all over the place so far in terms of intensity. I mean, this time yesterday it was a Category 4. So what happened?
Yeah, it's been really, really tricky. No question about that. And last night, right before the 11 o'clock advisory, the top readings they were getting were 107 miles per hour. They're using this device called the SFMR, and what it does is it scans the ocean surface and looks at the sea spray, and it's very accurate, generally within 10%. And again, the top winds that they found were 107 miles per hour. So they actually could have called this thing a Category 2 last night, but they didn't drop it that much. And I think that there's a measure of prudence there because they don't want to drop it way back and have it strengthen quite a bit overnight and then come in the morning as a Category 4. As it stood, it did end up weakening before it moved into Cancun. But then you've got this smaller system that is more susceptible to the environment, and it was wind shear that was bothering the system yesterday, and it is land that's been affecting the storm today, that interaction with land there. And so now, as the system is just offshore, Jackie, the hurricane hunters finding winds that are now just into Category 1 range. So it's going to be very interesting to see what successive passes find. We know that it's going to be in a very healthy environment for strengthening. You see a little bit of that easterly surge right there. It's going to begin to get away from that and into a light wind environment. But when you look at this model intensity guidance, well, this guidance is based on the storm being a 100 mile per hour storm, based on its starting there. So what happens if you lower that starting point considerably? Well, then you lower the forecast intensities as well. And so certainly that could be helpful if the storm is not as strong right now. We can keep our fingers crossed on that, Jackie.
But more intensity changes are likely, right? This is going to ramp back up, but then it could also ramp back down before landfall.
Yeah, that's exactly right, because we expect that there's going to be an increase in wind shear, and there's also going to be a change in the water temperatures. As you know, we've been looking at water temperatures for quite a while, all season long, and they've been way up there. There is a terrific amount of energy here in the Caribbean in particular. 120 mile per hour storm just offshore at that point, but then also the water temperatures do drop off and the wind shear will be increasing. So certainly it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with the storm. There is some potential that it could weaken right at the very last minute as it is moving onshore. So, again, we can hope for that, but if it's weaker to begin with, then that is going to have a downstream effect, and we can certainly hope for that as well.
All right, a lot of suspense to come. I want to pick your brain more on where it's going to be going in just a second, and any kind of changes and fluctuations that we could get from there. But let's show you the latest cone, because if you haven't tuned in since early this morning, we did get a little bit of a shift more towards the west with the cone today. So notice New Orleans no longer in the cone, eastern Texas still in the cone, but it doesn't mean that New Orleans isn't going to have any impacts, right? Remember, that can happen well outside the cone, especially on the east side or on the right side of that storm, because we're going to have that onshore flow and that push of water. So that still means Mississippi, Alabama, even the Florida Panhandle, we're going to get rip current issues here already for tomorrow. So the forecast track keeps it over open water all the rest of tonight, all the day tomorrow through the morning on your Friday, with landfall potentially into the afternoon hours on your Friday. So Lake Charles, Lafayette, Morgan City, all within the cone and within that target area as it gets picked up by a trough and starts to kind of hook back on off towards the right. Now, the good news out of all of this is that we don't see anything to really slow it down a lot. So the steering will continue to move it at a decent forward speed, so we won't get that big stall and that huge rain event. Now, that said, we'll still see some really significant rainfall totals with this, but ultimately storm surge is likely to be our greatest concern, and that may be a big issue in a place like Morgan City, Louisiana. Our Mike Seidel is in Morgan City right now. And Mike, I know they've got the walls that they put up here already today.
Yes, they're in pretty good shape as far as surge around the city because they have this big seawall. And a gentleman who is kind of in charge of the whole operation, Tim Mott with the St. Mary Levee District. Tim, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
And let's talk a little bit about the wall behind you. I know it was reconstructed in '85 after the '73 floods.
Right.
But a lot of times where we're standing is underwater. It's not because of tropical weather.
Right. River flooding every year. We're a distributary of the Mississippi. Every time you hear the Mississippi's in flood, the Atchafalaya is in flood. And so we experience that regularly. As a result of that, we have to close these gates fairly often, and particularly over the last few years, we've had to close them quite often. So they're exercised, they're ready to go, and they can work.
And let's talk a little bit about what your concern is. Once you get the gates closed, we're more than likely going to be okay based on the latest forecast. What about the areas around the lakes?
Well, that's always a concern because there is a backwater effect to that high water. But based on the current predictions, the backwater levees in protecting Morgan City should be of sufficient elevation to protect us from flooding on that side also.
And you mentioned you have some projects underway. You want to get those folks protected at least in the short term before the hurricane hits.
That's correct. It's actually a very busy time for the levee district. We have over $70 million worth of projects under construction right now. The problem is they're not ready. And you know, so in that particular case, we have one that we're temporarily closing. We just didn't have enough time to get it finished, so we're temporarily closing one. There's another one, we're building a small levee berm across an area to keep an area from inundating. And lastly, there's an area that we have a project under design on that for the last 3 storms we've had to close temporarily. We're implementing that one right now also, ensuring it up, getting it up a little higher.
And we talked about the record river level, and it didn't occur during a hurricane. And the fact that we're going into Delta with a river level of just about 2 feet, we're at a low river level, that's a real big help going into this.
It is. Hurricane Barry just last year, this river was already at 7, meaning we would be standing this deep in water right now and then put a storm surge on top of that.
Right.
Now we've got easily 3 feet before it gets to the top of the bank. So we've got a little more capacity to handle that, so that puts us a little bit at ease. Unfortunately, for the people that are on the unprotected side of the river here, they're just going to get subject to flooding.
And we have some already voluntary evacuations. Right. Okay, Tim Mott, thank you from the Levee District here, St. Mary. We're in St. Mary Parish. Jackie, good background on what they're expecting and what they're prepared for. But again, the fact that the river is so low going into Delta and the projected surge, that is a big, big positive.
Huge help for sure. Thanks so much, Mike. You know, another city along a river and not too far away from the ocean is New Orleans. So this is another place we have to watch very closely. You're no longer in the cone. You were yesterday for the 6th time this season. But just because you're not in the cone doesn't mean you're out of the woods altogether. You're under a tropical storm watch. And we think New Orleans is going to be on the right-hand side of the cone, which would put them in the area of onshore flow and some of those stronger winds that may come in and cause some surge issues even along Lake Pontchartrain there. I want to bring in our storm specialist, Carl Parker, again. And Carl, you know, track forecasting, where it's going, a little bit more solid generally than intensity forecasting, but still we have a little wiggle room one way or the other. What are you seeing for steering and direction with Delta?
Well, you know, one thing that we know is that there's going to be this upper low that comes into Texas, and that is going to preclude the system from moving into, say, the middle or lower Texas coast. That is off the table. We know that it's going to be grabbed up. We know that it's going to be taken to the north. The only question is, where exactly does it come in? And I'll tell you, the models really do appear to be settling in on that question. This is the latest run of the American model, the GFS model, showing you a landfall maybe just east of Cameron and then coming up towards perhaps Lafayette. Beyond that, you look at the ensemble members in the family of the GFS, a fair amount of clustering there coming into central and western parts of Louisiana. So, you know, it certainly seems that the modeling in large part is settling in on this idea. We can look at some of the other track model guidance as well, and you see it's generally there, including much of southwest and central parts of Louisiana. The European model also just came in recently, and it too shifting a little bit farther to the east, so more in line with all of the rest of this modeling, and it's looking less likely, for example, that we would see direct impacts in Houston. That doesn't appear to be very likely at this point. It looks like it's going to be Louisiana. The only question is where exactly. Will it be just to the east of Lake Charles? We certainly do hope so, as they've had such a terrible time already this year. And, you know, that appears to be the best bet right now.
It's good to see more of that model consistency. Certainly gives us more confidence in where it's going. Carl, you know, what is the change in terms of the trends, why it did shift a little bit westward for today? Do you think it's just the timing of that trough picking it up?
Yeah, I think that's probably it. I think that, you know, maybe the other thing was that some of the modeling showed it being a little bit slower, and it looks like it's going to be this trough is going to come right in and grab the system. So now it's really just a matter of, you know, pinpointing that area. But certainly does look like we're on track for a landfall there in southwest or central parts of Louisiana. We're going to have much more on this very dangerous storm coming up in a few minutes.
Hurricane season doesn't stop for a pandemic, and neither do we. Get the information you need to stay safe every day, right here on the Weather Channel.
Welcome back to the Weather Channel and Weather Center Live. We've got some new video just in showing you the aftermath of Delta on the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. This is a road in Cancun, and you can see all the debris into the roadway there. We've got some of those palm fronds that have all been pushed into the roadway. Looks like some of the branches and things have been broken off as well. Some ponding of water on the roadway. This is pretty minor compared to some of the other damage that we've seen across the area. Still lots of folks without power and a lot of cleanup to do there from Delta. So Delta made landfall in the wee hours of the morning, worked its way across the Yucatan Peninsula, and is now right here over the open waters back into the Gulf of Mexico. The hurricaners, hunters are in it right now, and they're flying through it to get a better idea of how much weakening may have taken place as it interacts with land. But don't be fooled by that. Right now it still is a Category 2 storm with 100-mile-per-hour winds, and it moves over the open waters of the Gulf, the very warm waters of the Gulf, in an environment with very light winds. That's going to allow it to get a little bit stronger. So the official forecast does have it going back up to a major hurricane before landfall. So that's what we need to be prepared here. This will likely happen sometime on Friday, more likely later in the day than sooner in the day. And it is going to be taking more of a turn up towards the north and then northeast, working its way through the Tennessee River Valley and into the Ohio River Valley. Now, this will continue to move with time, and that should help to keep our rainfall totals in check somewhat, but still the potential here, especially to the right of the path, where we could see as much to 6 to 12 inches of rainfall. All right, well, as Delta hits the Gulf and buzzsaws towards our coast, this is one of the big concerns. Those huge waves that Delta produced along the Cayman Islands and the surge that we could see as well. We want to bring in our storm specialist, Carl Parker. And Carl, the forecast has it becoming a major hurricane and then weakening back down before it reaches landfall. But one of the big concerns is that despite maybe the winds going down, that wind field is still going to be huge, and we've got big surge concerns as a result.
Yeah, there is some memory that occurs when you've got a very large storm and a strong storm. So let's imagine that we have a major hurricane that's got a very large wind field. What that's going to do is generate large waves. So even if the storm does come down in intensity right before it comes on shore, you're still going to have all these large waves that are helping to set up the storm surge. And so this is a look at the storm surge potential. And this does not mean that it's going to happen like this everywhere. It just means that this is the potential nearest the core of the storm. And that could very well be, say, around Vermilion Bay. We could be looking at a storm surge of 7 to 11 feet there. But this is dependent on the intensity of the storm. And it's been really interesting to watch what's going on with the storm right now. We'll talk more about that in a second. But large storms in general produce more surge. There's more wind over a larger area, and it lasts for a longer period of time. And so take a look at the area of strong winds as it stands right now. So I'm going to draw a line there across that area of strong winds. Now compare that size-wise to, say, the distance between Brownsville and nearly to New Orleans. You see how much larger that second area is, and that is what's going to happen as the storm approaches. This area of strong winds is going to really, really expand, and that will allow it to push in all the water. But, you know, again, Jackie, part of this is dependent on the intensity of the storm, and as the hurricane hunters are out in the system right now, what they're finding is that it's not terribly strong, at least not right yet. We'll see as they make successive passes whether that changes. But, you know, for now, what they're finding are winds that are at minimal hurricane force, Category 1 force.
That would certainly be better news for sure, but still a broader wind field is expected, and that's going to really churn up the ocean too. We could have some big rip current issues tomorrow, far from where the storm is.
Yeah, no doubt about that. You know, big part of what the storm is going to do, and there, by the way, is the core of the storm coming in as the GFS model sees it, may be between Lake Charles and Lafayette, and so again, that would maximize the surge in Vermilion Bay. Here's a look at the wave heights, and those wave heights are really growing here and expanding all across the northwest part of the Gulf, and so absolutely that is going to mean rip current threat in the northwestern Gulf Coast. It's going to mean also coastal flooding, and it's going to mean significant beach erosion across a lot of that region.
All right, thanks so much, Carl. Well, we want to update you on the situation in the Northeast right now. We've got some strong to severe thunderstorms along with some wind advisories and high wind warnings. Boston, you could get some gusts, 50, even as much as 60 miles per hour today. Albany right now, you're under a severe thunderstorm warning as a line of storms is approaching your area. So let's start out with the active radar right now. Here's Albany, and you can see the warnings for this line that has a history of producing some hail that's been collecting on the ground, generally pea-sized hail, but still not fun to be out in, and certainly hope the car is indoors. Damaging winds will be possible, and there's frequent lightning with this too. So Albany, that's going to stay in effect until 4 o'clock or so. That whole line will continue to track its way off towards the east and eventually reach the I-95 corridor. So be aware that this is going to last with a threat of strong to severe thunderstorms well into the evening hours, primarily into New England and areas up to the north where the wind field may be a little bit more damaging, but even outside of thunderstorms, we'll see those strong winds continue till about midnight.
Or watching America's most trusted TV news network,
We've got severe weather threat.
Winds have been gusting the full force of this thing.
the Weather Channel. Get your daily dose of everything weather on Quibi. From the viral
Now to the weather video that we cannot stop watching.
to the vital
Get ready because we are in for another wet week.
and all the wonderful weather in between.
Boy, do we have a lot to talk about.
Weather Today from the Weather Channel. New episodes every day, only on Quibi.
They're voluntary evacuations from the areas south of the Intercoastal Waterway. Those are the areas that always take on water when we have a storm like this.
All right, continue to track Hurricane Delta here. Delta made landfall over Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula overnight, and now it's back over the open water. It's a Category 2 storm, far cry from the 145-mile-per-hour Category 4 that it was this time yesterday, but that doesn't mean we're done just here, because it's going to spend a lot of time over the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, which continue to be very warm. So while it's in a weakened state at this time, almost looks like a little dry air trying to work its way into the northern side of this as well. It still has the opportunity to get stronger, and we should be prepared for a major hurricane. Always prepare for the worst and hope for the best. So this is tracking to the north and west right now. It's going to spend all tomorrow over the Gulf and then start to turn on out towards the north and then northeast. It's going to get picked up by a trough of low pressure in the upper levels of the atmosphere that's pulling in towards Texas right now, and will continue to keep this moving along. And so that's a little bit of good news. Landfall timing right now, we're thinking sometime midday or in the afternoon hours here on Friday. But look at the big difference in intensity from where it's expected to be on Friday morning compared to where it's supposed to be on Friday evening. Certainly it will weaken after it hits landfall, but cooler water temperatures and wind shear might bring it down very significantly. But despite the wind speeds potentially being a little bit lower, we still think surge is going to be a big problem. Our meteorologist Mike Seidel is in Morgan City, Louisiana. And Mike, here we go in the cone again under a hurricane watch. I'm sure this area very storm weary. Can you give us the mood, and what are people saying around there?
Well, they're concerned because this track is going to be farther, we think, farther east than Laura. Laura was far enough west that they didn't have any major impacts here. Water came up 3 feet, not a big deal. They had few power outages. In fact, some folks ended up being here after Lake Charles lost power for up to 3 weeks. Now, this is the seawall which protects them. This is 22 feet high. They about doubled it after the floods of '73. That was because the Mississippi was full and it backs up into the Atchafalaya Basin and the Atchafalaya River. In fact, this gate was closed last spring for a couple of months because the river was so high. Right now, the river's down about around 2 feet on the gauge. So that's a good thing, because even if they get a predicted peak storm surge of 7 to 11 feet, they don't have to worry about a lot of water getting in town with this kind of a seawall. And you can see how far it extends downriver. We're looking down the river, and that ends up in the lake northeast of town. So we've got 2 lakes on that side of town. They've got about an 8-foot berm there. They should be fine. And then we just have to worry about, significantly worry about the wind, the power of the wind, and do we have a lot of trees uprooted, and do we have a lot of power outages? And that's all about where the storm tracks, how wide it is, how big the core is. But the drone video gives you an idea from up above what it looks like here. The wall that goes on both sides of the river here and on the other side of the bridge here on the Atchafalaya River. So we're under that hurricane watch, a storm surge watch down on the Gulf, up to 7 to 11 feet. That's the extreme amounts, and that may be adjusted. But with the center expected to come in to our west, that would push the water up through the Atchafalaya Bay and up the river and right into this area, Carl. So a lot of things we're watching, but again, the fact that the hurricane Delta has weakened quite a bit since yesterday with 145-mile-an-hour winds. We're starting off lower than I think we had expected at this point as it gets back into the Gulf and has a chance to intensify. So maybe that'll shave some wind speed off the top.
Yeah, Mike, and we may be continuing to see that weakening trend right now. The hurricane hunters have made a second pass through the middle of the storm, and they found something very similar to that first pass with winds. And you see right in here, these are winds on either side of the eye, so they rise up right there, and then you have that low spot where there's no wind in the middle, and then they rise up once again. And so what it's showing us is that winds are basically barely at hurricane force in these last couple of passes. And so the storm certainly could be even weaker than is the official numbers right now. You look at the satellite picture, and there's still a big bursting of convection, but it's not incredibly well formed right now. And that certainly would have an impact downstream, as Mike mentioned. So this is the intensity model guidance here, showing this slight rise, getting up to perhaps some major hurricane intensity. Well, that is dependent on the starting position. If you change that starting position and you drop it to, say, Category 1 intensity, well, that's going to lower that intensity forecast as well. And we can hope for that. We'll talk more about this coming up in just a few minutes.
What would America's most trusted TV news network?
We've got a severe weather threat.
Winds have been gusting the full force of this thing.
The Weather Channel. Get your daily dose of everything weather.
Wow! Boy, do we have a lot to talk about.
Weather Today from the Weather Channel. New episodes every day, only on Quibi.
Welcome back, everybody. We've got some new video we want to share with you along the Louisiana coast where they're getting ready for Hurricane Delta. This new video showing you the shrimp boats in Lafitte shoring up against Delta and its threats. Sandbags have been down too to guard against anticipated surge and in-water flooding from the heavy rainfall. So lots of different threats that we're going to be facing here, unfortunately, with Delta. Nothing we can do to stop it, but something we can do to help protect ourselves, right? So stay informed throughout the duration. We've got you covered here at the Weather Channel leading up to, during, and after the storm. More live coverage from the fields in just a minute, but we want to give you an update on the latest of the storm, which is a Category 2 right now with winds of 100 miles per hour, made landfall on Mexico and is now back over the open waters, which will give it the opportunity to re-intensify once again now. The wind shear is very light, so it's moving into an environment where not only will it likely get stronger, but it will likely also grow in size. So that is a concern going forward, that we're going to have this large wind field with this that could really kind of increase those risks that we're expecting in terms of storm surge on the right-hand side of the storm. Landfall would be most likely sometime during the day on your Friday, and it does look like parts of Louisiana are going to be most vulnerable to that risk. We've got tropical storm watches and hurricane watches that have been posted now from eastern Texas all the way over towards Bay St. Louis into Mississippi, and these will likely change with time and be upgraded to warnings by tomorrow. Effects are going to be felt far inland because it will continue to move with forward speed. It will take a little longer for the winds to die down, but also heavy rainfall will move well inland into the Tennessee Valley as well as into the Ohio River Valley. While the Gulf prepares for Delta, another big story we're tracking is what's happening in the West, where they're still battling flames. This is new video of one of the stunning sights of the fires that rage in California. You can see the tree that is burning from the inside out. It's an example of the way the Creek Fire continues to blaze through parts of Northern California. Crews making some progress in curbing that gigantic fire. Now, this huge wildfire sweep across the western United States, it's a sobering realization that this could become the new and scary normal. Dave Malkoff is in Santa Rosa, California, examining how the changing climate is helping to spark new dangers.
This is an unprecedented fire season here in California. More than 4 million acres burned already. Not to mention the homes and the businesses and the lives lost all throughout the West. So what is driving all of this?
It's really nasty, Brent.
They're called Very Large Air Tankers. These flights over flaming hillsides are now a common sight.
And you're cleared to drop. Because there's no denying it, these fires are becoming larger, more destructive, and more frequent than ever before.
Things will burn hotter. The fires will be more aggressive.
The Glass Fire in Napa Valley is now nearly 70,000 acres. In the past, a fire a third that size may have happened once a year.
This year, we're looking at multiple 300,000, 800,000, 200,000 acre fires. These are huge swaths of California that have burned this year.
But this is one of those recurring nightmares. For example, 56 years ago, the Hanley Fire burned through wine country. Then in 2017, a repeat from the Tubbs Fire. Same area, different climate.
That fire in 1964 took 3.5 days. What the same fire in 2017 took 3.5 hours. What's going on in California is really the result of all of the factors climatically and as humans coming down to ground zero in a really, really dangerous way. Fire department!
It's dangerous because so many more people are moving into the woods. According to FEMA, there are 41% more homes in the fire zone now than there were in the 90s. Areas that could have naturally burned in the past have to be quickly put out by these firefighters. And right now, California's windy season is just getting started. Diablo and Santa Ana winds could easily fan this destruction right into next year.
It's not just land use planning. It's not just more staffing. It's not just more defensible space and more vegetation management. It's more of all of those things.
There's simply more heat available these days. In the last 5 years, there's been an increase in temperature in the overnight hours. That allows the trees and the leaves to get super crispy and ready to burn when the blazing sun comes out in the morning. In Santa Rosa, California, Dave Malkoff, The Weather Channel.
Long-term solutions needed here for sure. In the short term, we need some rain into the area. Some areas are going to get it, especially into the Pacific Northwest. California, unfortunately, it was looking optimistic a couple of days ago, but today, unfortunately, we're seeing too much trending to more of a drier scenario for you. I think coastal areas in Northern California, as well as in the Northern Sierra, may get some showers, but the bulk of the rain is going to be up here, especially into western parts of Oregon, as well as into Washington State, but they need it there too. So this is certainly going to help. So there you can see the big trough kind of digging in and our storm system working its way closer towards the coast. This won't be arriving really until the weekend. So our computer model forecast showing you that any of that energy that was driving towards California just kind of fizzles out, unfortunately, but we will at least get a cool down out of this. So heat relief will help a bit.
When your cameras roll,
This is something nobody can imagine.
our experts react.
What do you do?
Oh my gosh! Jaw-dropping.
Nope, 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 all the way back home.
It doesn't get better than this.
Don't miss all new episodes of Weather Gone Viral, Sunday nights at 9, here on the Weather Channel. Get your daily dose of everything weather.
Wow! Boy, do we have a lot to talk about.
Weather Today from the Weather Channel. New episodes every day, only on Quibi.
One of the biggest dangers from Delta is storm surge, and storm specialist Dr. Greg Postel shows us how Delta's storm surge could be life-threatening and in a way that you'll only see on the Weather Channel.
Dangerous Hurricane Delta is expected to make landfall in Louisiana on Friday and bring with it life-threatening storm surge. This is a forecast from the National Hurricane Center for the possibility of seeing water rises above normally dry ground to these levels. This is life-threatening and the kind of storm surge that you need to prepare for. Let's zoom in, though, on a couple of places. Let's go to Abbeville, Louisiana, and show you zoomed in how it might look on a block-by-block basis. These are maps produced by the National Hurricane Center and show you the depth and the coverage of this kind of inundation and how it would impact locally the neighborhoods. Maybe as much as 6 feet above normally dry ground, remember. Now let's go to Delcambre, Louisiana, also inland, but perhaps we see a bit more in Delcambre with the nearby canal. It is possible in many locations that we see water rises perhaps above 9 feet. That is practically unsurvivable. Why is that? Let me show you. Let's bring that water up to 3 feet. Now, when the water rises to 3 feet, it's too late to evacuate. It really is. This kind of water can sweep you off your feet, of course, carry a car away. Who knows what kind of large objects are floating around in it, or toxic chemicals for that matter. But some places are going to have higher water rises than this. Let's go to 9 feet. Water this high, there is no way to escape but up. And in many cases, this is not survivable. And is exactly why you need to follow the advice of the local officials and follow the forecast from the Weather Channel and the National Hurricane Center. Stay safe, everyone.
All right, so let's take a look at the latest on this storm. And from a satellite perspective, it is not an incredibly well-formed storm. And what's interesting is that the hurricane hunters have been out in the system. They've made a couple of passes through the center already. And what they are finding is winds just getting up to Category 1 intensity. So they're going to continue to go back and forth and see if they find something different than that. But that is really interesting and important because that could have an impact on the forecast down the road. Right now, it is a 100-mile-per-hour storm, Category 2 officially. But if it's something less than that, then that is going to change the forecast. And for example, we'll take a look at the model intensity guidance, and you notice that a lot of these models take it up to either strong Category 2 or just up to Category 3 as it is approaching the coast. And then we see it dropping down through a combination of factors. One would be lower water temperatures, another would be shear, another would be land interaction, though we could be looking at hurricane force winds well inland. But all of this, all of those lines are dependent on that initial starting position. So let's say you move that initial starting position to a lower position, more towards a Category 1 intensity, well, that changes the downstream forecast. And so here are the forecast intensities from the Hurricane Center. You know, the other possibility is that the storm could get its act together a lot more quickly. So we certainly don't want to rule that out. But certainly if it looks like it's getting a lot weaker at this time, that could definitely have an impact on this forecast. We've seen that in the last 24 hours as they dropped the intensities just a notch with what happened with the storm as it was approaching earlier today. Went from 145 miles an hour down to Category 2. So right now the forecast is for a major hurricane to be approaching as it comes towards the northern Gulf Coast. And again, there's going to be a reduction in intensity as it is nearing the coast, but you don't want to count on that. You should prepare for a major hurricane, and there are now hurricane watches up along the upper Texas coast into Lake Charles. I know that's the last thing that you want to see there in Lake Charles. We are so hoping that this storm passes a little farther to the east for your sake because you've been through so much already. But in that case, it could have more impact on Lafayette, Louisiana. Morgan City also in those hurricane warnings, as we expect it's going to be a larger storm and so a larger wind field and more people along the coast being affected by those strong winds. And also we're looking at a storm surge watch over a pretty broad section of coastline here. Keep in mind also that it's going to be moving off to the northeast after it moves inland, so the onshore flow is also going to follow the storm as it moves northeast. So here's a model forecast showing you that expansion of the area of strong winds. It really does blow out. Now, this again is dependent on the storm getting stronger and getting up to that major hurricane status. But you've got a large, powerful storm in this model depiction, which then starts to tangle with the coast early on Friday. That's when conditions would really begin to go downhill, and then it would get a lot worse, most likely later in the day on Friday, with that eye wall starting to come in, maybe near Cameron, maybe just a little farther to the east. We'll talk more about all these scenarios coming up in just a few minutes. And stay with the Weather Channel all day and week as we track Delta. Our teams spread out across the Gulf Coast to bring you the latest developments on this storm.
When your cameras roll, our experts react.
Jaw-dropping.
Weather Gone Viral, Sunday nights at 9, here on the Weather Channel.
Know your evacuation zones and make those storm runs right now. The clock is ticking for Hurricane Delta to make landfall on the Gulf Coast. Places affected by Laura are among the cities in the cone again. Hurricane hunters are flying in and around the storm right now to collect data and help us to warn you about the dangers of this storm. We have live coverage up and down the Gulf Coast as this Category 2 hurricane gets closer by the hour. Mike?
Hey, Jackie, good afternoon. We've got the mayor of Morgan City standing by, Frank Rizaffi. He's going to give us the latest on their plans, their preps here as Delta makes landfall here in the state of Louisiana sometime later on Friday. Jackie.
All right. We will look forward to that interview. Thanks, Mike. And thanks, everybody, for being with us today for our continuing coverage of Hurricane Delta. I'm meteorologist Jackie Jarris. We've got storm specialist Carl Parker. He's going to join us in just a second. Of course, Delta now forecast to be the 10th storm to hit the U.S. this year. When that happens, it will be a record breaker. It's also the 25th named storm of the season. So let's get you caught up with what we know right now about Delta. The governors of Louisiana and Alabama have declared a state of emergency. Mandatory evacuations were just ordered in low-lying areas prone to flooding in Vermilion Parish, Louisiana. Some of the state's schools districts are closed through Friday, and in Alabama, there are mandatory evacuations of tourists along the coast. So, Carl, we have had the 2 o'clock advisory for a moment. The hurricane hunters are in there right now. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with the upcoming advisory at 5 o'clock as the wind speeds that they're sampling aren't looking all that impressive at the moment.
Not very impressive right now at all. They found a peak flight level wind of 85 miles per hour and extrapolated that would indicate a low-end Category 1 hurricane. So it may very well be that because this has been a small storm, it really has been impacted by not just some ongoing wind shear, but also the interaction with land. So here you see the data from the hurricane hunters, and some of that dropped off of there. They're just getting ready to make a third pass through the core. It's going to be really interesting to see what they find there. But in the previous 2 passes, again, they have seen winds that would justify a Category 1 hurricane. So it may very well be that we see a reduction in speed with the new advisory that comes out at 5 o'clock. And that would have a downstream impact. And for example, you look at this model intensity guidance and it's showing you a storm that is a strong Category 2 or Category 3 coming towards as it gets closer to the coast on Friday here, but that is dependent on the starting position. If you lower that starting position, then it's going to change the trajectory of that intensity guidance, and accordingly, we might see a reduction in the forecast intensities from the National Hurricane Center. So they've got an awful lot to sort out here based on what's going on with the storm right now. At the same time, however, it is going to have a lot of time out over the open water, and it will have time to organize in a generally favorable environment with a lot of warm water. So it's certainly not out of the question that it becomes a very strong storm once again. There are hurricane watches now up parts of the Texas coast, Lake Charles. We, just really hope that we do not get the worst of this storm in Lake Charles. We know that you just don't want to deal with that after everything you've been through there. Lafayette could be in line for the worst of the storm. It may well come in near Cameron or maybe just a little east. Vermilion Bay could be in for some very serious surge. And we could be looking at hurricane force conditions as far east as Morgan City and a water level rise on the Atchafalaya River there. So there are the storm surge watches that are now in effect, extending across the Louisiana coast and then farther eastward as well. Once again, as I mentioned, it's going to be coming through very warm water in the Gulf of Mexico, and the upper level environment is going to be favorable, we think, over the next couple of days. Eventually, as the storm gets closer to the coast, we're going to see an increase in wind shear, so that could bring the wind speed down, and we're also going to see a drop off in the amount of warmth in the Gulf of Mexico. So there too, we might see a little bit of a change in the intensity right at the last minute, Jackie, but if this does become a very powerful storm once again, that might not make that much of a difference.
All right, Carl, I want to talk to you more about intensity, so stand by. But first, we want to share this video with you and show people what Delta did to the Yucatan Peninsula. Crews here starting to get out to survey the damage and start the cleanup process as well. You can still hear the winds, really gusty, right? You can see the impacts there from Delta. The wind snapping trees, peeling away some of the roofs, and also knocked down power lines as the storm roared ashore in very popular tourist areas here, very near Cancun. Now, in addition to the strong winds, the eye has been very small. In fact, there's a pinhole eye yesterday. This video from the hurricane hunters showing you what it looked like as they flew through Delta. More missions are set for today as Delta moves into the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, hurricane hunters making a pass right now, and we'll have another flight that's going to take off later on this afternoon. So, Carl, come back and let's talk about this intensity thing, because this is so interesting. It's very common to see fluctuations in intensity. We had a huge ramp up. It was a 145 mile per hour storm this time yesterday. And now we're looking at a measly 100-mile-per-hour storm, maybe. We expect storms to weaken over land, but a lot more happen between here and there. Can you explain?
Well, yeah, and it has a lot to do with, you mentioned that pinhole eye that was about 4 miles across, has a lot to do with that. When you've got a really large system, it takes a long time for the intensity to increase. And the opposite is true. It takes a long time for it to spin down. But when you've got a smaller system, and this one had an exceptionally small core, they can ramp up really fast, and it went right up to 145 yesterday. And then by last evening, we were looking at wind speeds on the order of 107 miles per hour. So it had already likely weakened to Category 2 intensity by last evening. And then additionally, we've had this wind shear in place. And additionally, you have the interaction with land today. And that appears to be doing a number on the core of the storm. There you see the wind shear. Notice those winds coming in from the east there into the east side of the circulation. So I think between that wind shear and the interaction with land, we continue to see this weakening trend with the system. And, you know, it is going to be really interesting to see where we go from here, because as I mentioned at the top there, the hurricane hunters are finding winds of Category 1 intensity. And if that is in fact the case, if that is where they start, well, that has a downstream effect, and we may not be looking at as strong a storm in the Gulf, and then eventually towards landfall as well.
So having a lower starting point basically in the Gulf certainly could help us down the line, but still intensification is going to happen likely regardless.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I mean, there's going to be a lot of very warm water in place, and we're going to be looking at optimal conditions in terms of wind. I'll go back to this graphic showing you the intensity forecast here, or rather the intensity factors. So, you know, by this time tomorrow, it's going to be sitting over an area of very warm water in the Gulf of Mexico. So that certainly is not going to be holding it back. Excuse me. And then when you look at the upper level environment, we often talk about wind shear and whether or not the storm is being affected by strong winds aloft. That appears to be less likely tomorrow. And in fact, with these strong winds that are just off to the north, that can actually enhance the development of the storm by evacuating mass, as the storm has a model where you've got warm and humid air that comes in near the base of the storm, it rises up through the middle and then comes out at the top. When you've got very, very strong winds that are not over the storm but nearby, that can actually enhance the intensity. So that is also, I think, a possibility tomorrow and going into early Friday. But eventually, we're going to watch it move up and into those stronger winds, and that's when we expect that weakening trend to begin there as it gets closer to the coast.
All right. We want to talk more about the weakening trend and some reasons why that might not matter that much. That's coming up in just a second, but also about the steering. Let's show you the latest forecast cone before we get to the steering conversation. This is from the National Hurricane Center from the 11 o'clock advisory Eastern time. So as our next advisory comes in, that will happen by the top of the hour. Sometimes it happens already by the bottom of the hour, 30 minutes early. So make sure you stay with us through this hour, because as soon as that comes out, we will bring it to you. And there has been a little bit of a change in the cone now compared to what we had this time yesterday, and it did get shifted just a little bit westward, making southwestern Louisiana a little bit more vulnerable. Unfortunately, the storm is moving northwesterly right now, but that trough that Carl was just talking about is going to start to pick it more northerly and then kick it off towards the north and towards the east. So that's why we're kind of honing in on this area, central Louisiana, western parts of Louisiana. Notice a place like New Orleans is not in the cone, but it doesn't mean you're not going to have impacts. We're going to talk more about New Orleans in just a second, because you're still under a tropical storm watch. A place like Houston is out of the cone. You look like you're probably going to be in good shape on this one, but just a little bit of movement with that center could really have a difference on impacts. If that storm comes in to the east of Lake Charles, they would be much better off. The community is so vulnerable and compromised right now because of what happened with Laura. Now, Morgan City, you're kind of on the edge of the cone. We think you're going to be having some big impacts, and we want to find out how preparations are going there right now. Our meteorologist Mike Seidel is in Morgan City with the latest. Hey, Mike.
Hey, Jackie, good afternoon from Morgan City. Hurricane watch here. We're going to be watching the Atchafalaya River, and we've got Mayor Frank Grisafi from Morgan City, who's wrapping up his second term at the end of the year. So you've been through quite a bit because you grew up here. What's the feeling right now here in Morgan City? Of course, you've got this huge seawall, which is really a godsend.
Yes, so I'm feeling right now is we're treating this as what it is, a very serious storm. So we start our hurricane preparation like we do every storm. So far this year, we've been fortunate. Storms are hitting to the east, to the west. We have not taken a hit yet, but we prepare for everyone like it's coming right at us.
Getting a little tired of this?
It is. It's tiresome. We've got 38 gates to close on these seawalls, depending on what tide we're going to get. So it looks like that surge is going to be somewhere between 7 and 11 feet. So that requires us to close every gate below 12 feet, which pretty much is our entire city.
Are you worried about the areas on the other side of town with the lakes?
No, we got backwater there, but that water would have to really come up to start affecting that simply because we're at a low water season right now. If our water was elevated, it would be a different story. But I think the water issue we can handle pretty good. We're concerned about the wind. They've not really nailed down an exact forecast for that wind prediction, but we're watching every update to see what happens.
Yeah, we were looking at the wind forecast in the European, and it's forecasting wind gusts here potentially 75, maybe 80 miles an hour. That's not etched in stone, but you mentioned talk about your power infrastructure in town.
Yeah, and look, federal levee system, great backwater levees, water-wise. We're in the best shape on the coast. Our issue is keep the utilities running, depending on how much and how long that wind blows. But our citizens have grown used to hurricanes. They know what to do. And if it gets too serious, we'll call for some type of evacuation. But right now, there's a lot of ifs in the forecast, so we'll just kind of wait for them to settle out.
Well, we expect the only mandatory evacuation to be in the low-lying areas.
Yeah, that's called by the parish president. He's already called for a voluntary evacuation. I'll look for that to grow maybe to a mandatory later. We'll wait for the word from him. But that's everybody below the highway that aren't blessed with a great flood protection system like the city of Morgan City.
Oh, yeah, this is incredible. 22 feet.
Right.
I mean, that's got to protect you from about anything that the atmosphere can throw at you.
Yeah, the highest on record right now up that wall is 10.5 feet, so that's about 4 feet above the ground. So we got plenty of room to go.
Yeah, okay. Mayor, thanks for joining us. Mayor Frank Gravassi, right? Gravassi, with the mask on. Hard to say. Sometimes you inhale the mask. Anyway, Jackie, there's the mayor. He's got the positive attitude, but this seawall is just a monster. So that's really not the worry. It's really the worry is about how strong the winds are, structural damage and power outages here in Morgan City.
All right, great report, Mike. Lots of good information there, and I've had that happen to me like 1,000 times with the face mask. So like, get sucked into your mouth. Just one of the things we're having to deal with right now, for sure. Thanks. New Orleans, you're another place that we have to keep an eye on very closely. You're now officially out of the cone, but it's not too far away, and you're not out of the woods just yet. And that's because the size of the storm is expected to be large enough. You're under a tropical storm watch, and you may have some surge impacts with that onshore flow into Lake Pontchartrain. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about what kind of wiggle room we could have in terms of the track with Delta. Could this still wiggle a little bit to the right and get a little closer towards New Orleans, or are we expecting it potentially to stay a little more westward? It could really make a difference, Carl, for a place like Lake Charles right now.
Yeah, the models seem to be settling in on this idea of the storm coming in perhaps near Cameron or just a little to the east of Cameron. I want to show you some of this new model intensity guidance. This is brand new just in. And so, you do see a ramping up here. The highest end of these intensity models that we're showing right here, not actually getting it up to anywhere near category 4 intensity, but rather solidly into major there for some of those models. But, that depends on where the storm starts out. And we'll have, look at that coming up with the 5 o'clock advisory. So here's a look at the forecast cone. There's the US GFS model, and that is showing a landfall perhaps near Cameron or just east. A lot of the ensemble members getting closer together, so we're seeing less spread in that model guidance. Still a range there from far southwest Louisiana to the central part of the state, so that certainly could involve any area between Lake Charles and Lafayette. Other computer models basically on board with that, and we've got the new ensemble members from the European model, and there's been a subtle but detectable shift to the east in those members as well. And so it does appear that the storm is going to be taking aim on southwest, south central Louisiana. There's the GFS model showing the core approaching on Friday, so conditions starting to really go downhill at that time, and then the storm moving in, getting towards late Friday. There could be significant surge in Vermilion Bay in that scenario, and we certainly could be looking at a big windstorm for Lake Charles and for Lafayette. We'll talk more about these scenarios and also the wind that can be expected fairly far inland.
Hurricane season doesn't stop for a pandemic, and neither do we. Get the information you need to stay safe every day, right here on the Weather Channel.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We've got some more new video into the Weather Channel showing you all of the people who flocked to Cancun's airport yesterday ahead of Delta. Thousands trying to flee before Delta arrived in the overnight hours. Now, a short time ago, we just learned that the president tweeted this about Hurricane Delta, quote, was just briefed on Hurricane Delta and spoke with Governor Abbott of Texas and Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards. Please heed the directions of your state and local officials. We are working with them very closely. Please be prepared, be careful, and be safe. That's from our president, Donald Trump. All right, let's give you the latest on Delta, where it is and where it's going to be going next. It's a Category 2 storm at the last advisory, but the hurricane hunters are in there sampling it. We'll see by the top of the hour what kind of changes, if anything, we're going to get in there. You can see it doesn't look quite as impressive on satellite imagery. It appears that maybe some drier air is trying to get in on the northern side of that thing. A storm always weakens when it moves over land, but now it's back over the open water. And in fact, it might be seeing some signs here in the last couple of images here on the satellite that it might be trying to blow up a little bit near the center. So we'll keep an eye whenever you see those kind of trends. You get more confidence in that. But we do think it is still going to intensify because it's got all tonight. It's got all day tomorrow over the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. So it will likely go up. It's forecast to become a major hurricane again before weakening before landfall sometime on Friday. We think some wind shear and some cooler water temperatures could weaken it just a little bit. But I still think we're going to have some life-threatening impacts that could be really huge. A storm surge will be a big problem, as well as the threat of inland flooding. The storm will keep moving, so we're not worried about it stalling out, but 6 to 12 inches is on the table in spots. As Delta hits the Gulf and buzzsaws towards the coast, this is one of the big concerns. Check it out. Huge waves that Delta produced along the Cayman Islands. The surge came along with that as well. So I want to bring in our storm specialist, Carl Parker, to discuss this a little bit more, Carl. And we keep saying, oh, it's going to weaken a little bit before landfall, but that might not be all that significant, quite honestly, especially not when it comes to surge.
No, and you have to think about what happened with Katrina, which was for a time a Category 5 storm. And while it was a Category 5 and a large circulation, it was generating this enormous area of large waves. So even as the storm came to the coast and weakened to a Category 3, the storm surge was much higher than what you would normally expect with a Category 3 because that large wave field had already been generated. So Here you see the storm surge watches that are in effect and the latest storm surge potential from the Hurricane Center. Now, this does not mean that we expect to see this level of surge in all of these locations. Rather, it is showing you the potential, which is relative to where the core of the storm comes on shore. So if, for example, you've got an eye wall in that position, well, that's going to maximize that surge at Vermilion Bay in particular. That's where we could be looking at a 7 to 11 foot surge, and you want to be prepared for that. But again, that's not necessarily going to happen in all of these cases here. One thing that we're thinking about is the size of the storm, and larger storms produce more surge. There's more wind over a larger area, and it affects the ocean for a longer period of time. And I want you to pay attention to the size of the wind field here. So if we look at the area of strong winds from one side to the other, and you look at the width of that, let's compare that to the width of, say, an area near Brownsville to almost near New Orleans. And now let's take a look at how this wind field expands over time going into Thursday and Friday. You see, by the time we get into Friday, that area of strong winds does indeed fill up the Gulf from about Brownsville all the way to New Orleans. And so that's what we mean by a large storm. And, it's going to be that much more capable of producing a significant surge, Jackie.
Yeah, it really does make a difference with a large wind field to have those far-reaching impacts. But storm surge is really complicated, Carl. It's not just the size of the storm, it's the coastline and a lot of different factors.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for example, when you've got a concave coastline like you have in eastern parts of Louisiana, that certainly can capture more water. When you've got a shallow shelf, that allows the water to pile up a lot more easily. And then the size of the storm, really matters in terms of how much surge is being produced. So yes, it's a complex series of factors. It's probably one of the most complicated things about tropical cyclones in general. And, it's always a little bit different. And, you look back to what happened with Laura, and we didn't see that much surge in Lake Charles because the storm was about 15 miles farther to the east. That little of a difference made that much difference there in Lake Charles. But east of there, they had a surge as high as 13 feet.
Yeah, huge difference for sure. Carl, we want to update folks real quick on the Northeast. We're running out of time, but just want to give you a heads up. In Albany and Boston, we've had strong to severe storms that have been rumbling through the Northeast, and they've been producing some hail as well as some damaging winds. We still have warnings in effect that include you in Albany right now, and we're getting reports of tree damage and some power outages. In fact, tens of thousands of people without power in upstate New York right now as this line of storms continues to track off towards the east. So be prepared along the I-95 corridor. This is headed your way eventually, and the risk of severe weather has been upgraded compared to earlier today.
You're watching America's most trusted TV news network.
We've got a severe weather threat.
Winds have been gusting the full force of this thing.
The Weather Channel. Get your daily dose of everything weather on Quibi. From the viral
now to the weather video that we cannot stop watching
to the vital.
Get ready because we are in for another wet week.
And all the wonderful weather in between.
Boy, do we have a lot to talk about.
Weather Today from the Weather Channel. New episodes every day, only on Quibi.
There are voluntary evacuations from the areas south of the Intercoastal Waterway. Those are the areas that always take on water when we have a storm like this.
Continue to track Hurricane Delta here at the Weather Channel now. Made landfall on the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico last night and early this morning, and now working its way through the Gulf of Mexico, and will take its time doing it. We've got all tonight, we've got all of tomorrow, and probably the first half of Friday for this to work itself together and intensify, unfortunately. Once again, right now it's a Category 2 storm. The hurricane hunters are flying into this right now, and we should have an update from the National Hurricane Hurricane Center really any moment. It could happen anytime. When it does happen, we will bring that to you, but we always get it by about the top of the hour. This is forecast to move towards the north coast here of the Gulf and perhaps very likely make landfall along Louisiana coastline, maybe central or southwestern parts of Louisiana. It will continue to move with forward speed up towards the north and east as a trough starts to kick it out, heads towards the Tennessee River Valley as well as into the Ohio River Valley, which will have some impacts down the line. So the cone getting shaved down as confidence grows with time and it gets a little bit closer. But just because you're not in the cone doesn't mean you're not going to have impacts, because we certainly will, especially to the right of this cone. Well, smack on the edge of it is where we have Morgan City, Louisiana. That's where we find our Mike Seidel. And Mike, we heard from the mayor earlier that they're in pretty good shape when it comes to storm surge, but there are still other threats, and I'm sure people there are very storm weary this year.
Well, they are when you're in that many cones, and they've had a close call with Laura, but it was far enough west. We're thinking the track of Hurricane Delta will be a bit farther east. That puts them, certainly they're going to be on what we call the dirty side of the storm. We're going to have the wind, the surge issue, and the rainfall. But the rainfall, it's not going to be prolific like Sally because the storm's going to be moving at a really nice clip. Sally, remember, landfalled at about 2 or 3 miles an hour forward speed. This is the Atchafalaya River. We're fortunate it's down at about 2 feet. Now, with Barry last summer, it was up around 6 or 7. Remember, when the Mississippi gets full, the water ends up here in the Atchafalaya Basin and backs up. And this is the giant door, one of those gates here, the seawall that goes up to 22 feet. They finished this in 1985. It was only at about 12 feet. And they've only been up to about 10.5 to 11 feet so far, Barry last year. But again, with Barry, the water was already higher on the river. You can see the where the water was in the spring. So they had these gates closed for a couple months back in the about any surge, even if they get up to 7, 8, 9 feet. But they are concerned, Jackie and Carl, about losing power here, more so, and some structural damage, more so than river water getting into the city. Not with a wall like that, my gosh. This is no way that's going to happen.
Yeah, good to see that they are protected there. Mike, thank you so much. And we continue to follow the hurricane hunters, and in this latest pass, they found the strongest winds yet going through the core of the storm, but they have topped out. This is an estimated wind from a device called the SMRF or the SFMR, and winds at 81 miles per hour. So a lot of evidence supporting the idea that we may be looking at a Category 1 hurricane, and we'll see what happens with the next advisory from the Hurricane Center, but that could have some effect on the downstream forecast. Right now it is currently a Category 2, a 100 mile per hour wind. We expect the full forecast package coming out with the 5 o'clock advisory, so that's going to be out here within the next half hour. There you see the current forecast and calling for the storm to be a major hurricane as it is approaching the coast. Even if the storm is weaker for a time, it's going to have a lot of time out over the open water. So I would certainly not say that it couldn't catch up and once again become a really powerful storm. We're going to see plenty of time out over the water, and there's plenty of warmth in that water, and the upper level environment should be a little bit more favorable. There's been some shear in the last 24 hours, and that has had an impact on the circulation. That's going to go away for a couple of days, and then as the storm is approaching, we expect that there's going to be an increase in wind shear, but that's probably not going to have a huge effect. Also, the water temperature is dropping off, so we will see the storm gradually declining in intensity right as it is starting to come on shore. Well, just a reminder, for the latest stories on climate and the environment and sustainability, you want to be sure to check out Pattern on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat.
We're watching America's most trusted TV news network.
We've got a severe weather threat.
Winds have been gusting the full force of this thing.
The Weather Channel.
Being here, and thank you for your continued coverage of the various disasters and public health emergencies. And I will tell you, the information that you relay to the public over the next few days will be critically important. I am joined again today by Ben Schott of the National Weather Service. He'll be updating you on Hurricane Delta in just a few moments. Today, I sent a letter to President Trump requesting a pre-landfall major disaster declaration. He called about an hour ago. He indicated to me that he would be signing that declaration when it reached his desk, which we expect to happen later today or perhaps tomorrow morning. And I want to thank him for that. He indicated that he and his administration, and in particular FEMA, would be leaning forward with the state of Louisiana in advance of Hurricane Delta, but also in its aftermath, they would stick with us. And so we appreciate his prompt attention to the request and the assistance that he's already made available to us. And I'm expecting that pretty soon we're going to have official notification that that declaration has been signed. As you probably know, Hurricane Delta is currently forecasted to make landfall as a Category 3 major hurricane in Louisiana on Friday afternoon. That means that by Friday morning, conditions will be deteriorating rapidly. And so what I'm trying to impart to the people of Louisiana is that by the end of the day Thursday, you need to be where you intend to be as you ride out the storm, and you need to be postured however you need to be postured. So do all the work that you need to do to fortify your position to get ready. Make sure you have your supplies on hand. And if you have any question about what that should look like, go to getagameplan.org. And it will help you. And again, we are in a COVID environment, and so that list of things that you need and some of the things that you need to do will be different this year than it's been in the past. While the track has shifted a little bit west, it is still true that the overwhelming majority of the coast of Louisiana remains in the cone. So please don't get too fixated on the center line of the track. And in fact, a third of storms actually make landfall outside of the cone. So nobody should get too fixated on any of this, but we should all be aware that the storm is coming, that it's going to be a very serious storm. Delta is forecasted to be a hurricane in as far north as central Louisiana, too. We saw this with Hurricane Laura. And so we're not just speaking to Louisiana residents in the coastal area of our state. We're speaking to everybody in the state of Louisiana today. And in fact, we don't expect the hurricane to become a tropical storm until just about the time it exits northeast Louisiana. So everyone should be ready. At this time, a hurricane watch has been issued for just about the entire Louisiana coast. No one should let their guard down. And with a lot more specific and detailed information, I'm going to ask Ben to come up and give you a briefing. Now, none of you called him back up for any questions yesterday. So I'm going to ask you, if you've got questions, go ahead and do it when he finishes speaking, because I want to make sure that the information that he and the National Weather Service has is very clearly articulated to the people of Louisiana. So if you've got a question of Ben at the conclusion of his remarks, please ask him those questions. I'll come back to the podium on the back side of his presentation.
Thank you, Governor. Again, we're here to talk a little bit about...
Listening to Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards addressing the state and talking about preparations and how to get ready as the Hurricane Delta begins to approach. So let's give you the latest of what's been going on here with Delta. It was a very large, very powerful hurricane, this time yesterday with winds of 145 miles per hour. It did weaken before landfall over the Yucatan Peninsula in the early morning hours, but now it's back over the open waters. So it does have the potential to intensify once again, and that's a concern. Maximum winds right now are 100 miles per hour, so that's a Category 2 storm that's moving northwest and will continue continue on that direction, on that track, we think, for the next maybe 24 hours before it begins to pull up towards the north, eventually working its way towards the U.S. coastline. And you heard the governor there talking about almost all of Louisiana now under that hurricane watch. And there you can see that most of the state is also covered under that cone. So now is the time to prepare. You should be prepared by the time you go to bed on Thursday night, because those tropical storm force wind impacts are going to be arriving by the time you wake up, and it will continue to track up to the north and east across the state, move towards Mississippi, through the Tennessee River Valley, and then eventually into the Ohio River Valley as well. So keep in mind, this is not just a coastal storm. Impacts happen well outside of the cone, and we're going to feel impacts well inland as well. Very heavy rain may be hitting you in places like Memphis as well as into Paducah. Even the Ohio Valley could pick up 1 to 3. We'll be right back.
Unbelievable,
this is real.
When your cameras roll,
This is something nobody can imagine.
our experts react.
What do you do? Oh my gosh. Jaw-dropping.
Nope, 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 all the way back home.
It doesn't get better than this.
Don't miss all new episodes of Weather Gone Viral, Sunday nights at 9, here on the Weather Channel. Get your daily dose of everything weather.
Wow. Boy, do we have a lot to talk about.
Weather Today from the Weather Channel. New episodes every day, only on Quibi.
I'd say this is about the 5th time we've taken the boats out, or at least getting all the rods and all the gear out, and just kind of went home and watched and waited.
It is an all too common occurrence this hurricane season along Louisiana's Gulf Coast. People gearing up to flee ahead of a huge tropical threat. In Grand Isle, residents preparing to evacuate for a 4th time this year. One boat captain has had to cancel or reschedule 100 fishing trips, and restaurants struggling with not only tropical trouble, but the slowdown brought on by the pandemic as well. Well, one of the biggest dangers from Delta is going to be storm surge, and storm specialist Dr. Greg Postel shows us why Delta's storm surge will be life-threatening in a way that you'll only see on the Weather Channel.
Dangerous Hurricane Delta is expected to make landfall in Louisiana on Friday and bring with it life-threatening storm surge. This is a forecast from the National Hurricane Center for the possibility of seeing water rises above normally dry ground to these levels. This is life-threatening and the kind of storm surge that you need to prepare for. Let's zoom in, though, on a couple of places. Let's go to Abbeville, Louisiana, and show you zoomed in how it might look on a block-by-block basis. These are maps produced by the National Hurricane Center and show you the depth and the coverage of this kind of inundation and how it would impact locally the neighborhoods. Maybe as much as 6 feet above normally dry ground, remember. Now let's go to Delcambre, Louisiana, also inland, but perhaps we see a bit more in Delcambre with the nearby canal. It is possible in many locations that we see water rises perhaps above 9 feet. That is practically unsurvivable. Why is that? Let me show you. Let's bring that water up to 3 feet. Now, when the water rises to 3 feet, it's too late to evacuate. It really is. This kind of water can sweep you off your feet, of course, carry a car away. Who knows what kind of large objects are floating around in it, or toxic chemicals for that matter. But some places are going to have higher water rises than this. Let's go to 9 feet. Water this high, there is no way to escape but up. And in many cases, this is not survivable. And it's exactly why you need to follow the advice of the local officials and follow the forecast from the Weather Channel and the National Hurricane Center. Stay safe, everyone.
All right, we have the new advisory from the National Hurricane Center, and as expected, the storm is not as strong as it was at the last advisory, now down to a Category 1 storm with winds of 85 miles per hour, moving northwest still at 17 miles per hour. It's been certainly affected by wind shear as well as land interaction, and it's had a smaller core all along, so we knew that it would be more susceptible. But in the long term, it's got time out over the open water in the Gulf of Mexico. There's plenty of warm water. We expect that the shear is going to be lighter, and that should allow the storm to re-strengthen, being forecast to get up to 115 miles per hour early on Friday, and then some slight weakening before it comes in, but coming in as a Category 2 storm at 105 miles per hour. And you see the track there, which basically implicates southwest Louisiana and the central Louisiana coast as well. So pretty much on track here with what we have seen so far. No change in terms of the warnings. Hurricane watches still up across parts of the Louisiana Gulf Coast, and that from Lake Charles into Lafayette into Morgan City, as well as small part of the Texas Gulf Coast, and then also the storm surge warnings in effect all across the Louisiana coast and extending into Mississippi as well. Now, talking about some of the factors here that we're watching the next couple of days, we know that there's going to be plenty of warm water available for this storm to continue to get its act together, to re-strengthen as it moves out into the Gulf. We also know that the winds are generally going to be light. There has been some wind shear affecting the circulation over the last 24 hours. That's likely going to back away. And not only that, we see some stronger winds along the northern Gulf Coast. That may actually assist in the circulation and the ventilation of the storm as it is moving to the north. But eventually, the storm is going to begin to run into that stronger wind. That is likely going to serve to weaken it right as it's moving in. Also, water temperatures will drop off in the northern Gulf, and that too could serve to weaken the storm right as it's moving in. But it's still expected to be a powerful storm coming onshore, and this is going to be on Friday. And I want you to notice the expanse of the area of strong winds, and watch how this greatly expands outward going into Friday. So it covers a lot of the northwestern part of the Gulf of Mexico. And so we're seeing the winds starting to come in early on Friday, conditions really going downhill on Friday. And then the core of the storm likely coming in, going into Friday evening. We may see some differences in terms of timing and the exact track of the storm, but this is the general idea. That core coming in perhaps late on Friday, continuing to move up perhaps towards Lafayette, maybe just east of Lake Charles, but it's also possible that we see more direct impacts in Lake Charles. And stay with the Weather Channel all day and all week as we track Delta. Our team spread out across the Gulf Coast to bring you the latest developments on this storm.
You're watching America's most trusted TV news network,
We've got a severe weather threat.
Winds have been gusting the full force of this thing.
the Weather Channel.
Well, next on Weather Underground, Hurricane Delta now entering the Gulf of Mexico and closing in on the U.S. coast. Hurricane storm surge watches issued for portions of the Texas and Louisiana coastline, including many of the same areas ravaged by Hurricane Laura in late August. We have live team coverage.
In Delta, battering Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula overnight, the storm making landfall with winds of 105 miles per hour, knocking out power, slamming the resort areas of Cancun and Cozumel with dangerous storm surge. And tonight, the Hurricane Hunter mission's ongoing. As this powerful storm threatens to intensify once again, we have in-depth analysis of Delta's future track and every scenario for landfall and beyond. It's all next on a special extended edition of Weather Underground. And we appreciate you being with us tonight for Weather Underground. I'm Mike Bettis.
I'm Alex Wilson. We are covering every angle of Hurricane Delta to help you get ready. If you've got any questions, send them our way. Use the hashtag Hurricane Questions on Twitter, and we will be answering them throughout the show. Mike, we had questions last night. I would imagine now that we're a little closer, we've got a whole lot more questions.
Maybe even more, that's for sure.
Yes.
We've got the new advisory here in the last couple of minutes from the Hurricane Center, so I want to bring that to you. And not unexpected, but a weakening Delta at this point. The interaction with the Yucatan Peninsula has really done a number on it here. Also, a little bit of wind shear that's moved in from the south and east here. We've got an 85 mile per hour Category 1, but is now emerging back out over the Gulf of Mexico. So over the course of time here over the next 24 hours, we do anticipate some re-strengthening here Pressure's come up quite a bit as the winds have come down. Northwest movement at 17. A gradual turn to the north and eventually off to the northeast is anticipated. So there's a look at the forecast track. Not a whole lot of changes here over the last 24 hours. But as you can see, by tomorrow morning, back up to a 100-mile-per-hour hurricane here, a Category 2. And then by Thursday or even late Thursday, Friday morning, likely going to be, once again, a Category 3, a major hurricane. And then taking aim at this point, looks like Louisiana's pretty much locked in here, and then forcing its way even up toward maybe the Ohio Valley here. So a lot of areas inland could also be impacted by what this hurricane brings. Hurricane watch is in effect here. Does include around the Beaumont, Port Arthur areas in Louisiana, or in Texas, I should say. Lake Charles, Lafayette, Morgan City, all under hurricane watches. New Orleans right now, as well as Baton Rouge, under a tropical storm watch, as we may be more on the fringes of the real core of the hurricane winds here. On the infrared satellite, you can see that we've shrunk in the area where we have the really intense cloud tops here and the most intense thunderstorms within the hurricane. But there could be another blow up overnight tonight. A lot of times we'll get nighttime or nocturnal convection, which can enhance the strengthening or the overall strength of a hurricane. Again, you look at the water vapor imagery. It's fending off dry air at this point. It's going to go over a lower wind shear environment and over warm sea surface temperatures. So at this point, we think that strengthening is pretty likely from this point going forward, even though it's weakened pretty significantly today, but it's going to grow in size as well. That's always a concern here, Alex. Over the next 24 to 48 hours, growing in size and intensity.
All right, well, here's what we know at this hour. States of emergency have been declared in both Alabama and Louisiana. In Louisiana, mandatory evacuations, they're in place in Vermilion Parish. The president was briefed today on Hurricane Delta. He's asking Gulf Coast residents to pay close attention to what their local and state officials are asking them to do. And the Missouri LSU football game will move to Columbia, Missouri to get out of Delta's path on Saturday. That was originally scheduled to be held at LSU. Want to check in right now with meteorologist Paul Goodloe live for us this evening in New Orleans. And Paul, I got to imagine the folks there in New Orleans are getting awfully sick of seeing the Weather Channel trucks roll in.
They are. In fact, the hotel lobby, people are like, oh no, the Weather Channel is here. And they know I've been in some serious hurricanes this year, but I tell you what, New Orleans is definitely kind of doing the whole Matrix thing, kind of dodging the cones here. Looks like we're going to be on the east side of that cone, but also is the east side of the hurricane center, which is not that great because we're still going to have an onshore flow. Right now we're seeing kind of an east-northeast wind, but we're going to see that continue, even a stronger east wind. So I think winds will be a much bigger issue than the rain. Latest forecast have us maybe 1 to 2 inches of rain. We can deal with that here in New Orleans. Again, the city kind of below sea level. It relies on pumps to pump the rainwater out to keep the city dry. And this is a fast-moving hurricane as well, so it doesn't look like a prolonged rain event like we did see last month with Hurricane Sally, well to the east of here. But we still expect impacts here. We're still crossing our fingers that the rain is just in that 1 to 2 inch range and moves on, but we do think it's going to be a much bigger wind event. As Mike was just mentioning, as this hurricane grows, so does the wind field. So if you're in New Orleans or in this area here, southeast Louisiana, if you're enough away from the coast, you definitely have to prepare for perhaps power outages. Basically today, this evening, and into tomorrow are your times to prepare. By tomorrow night, sun going down, that's the time to basically ride this one out and pray for your neighbors farther west of you, who unfortunately could see another direct landfalling here in the state of Louisiana. I guess there really is no good time to have a hurricane, but if there is a worse time, it certainly would be now. Yet another landfalling hurricane in Louisiana, still during this COVID-19 year as well. So, Mike, we're still hoping that we're going to see this thing move pretty quickly and hopefully even weaken and don't have time to strengthen as it approaches the coast as we head on towards Friday evening, Saturday morning.
Yeah, there are a couple of things we're looking at, Paul, and we'll try to figure that out here over the course of the next 2 days, exactly what will happen at landfall time. But I think you're spot on there. It looks like Louisiana is squarely in this forecast cone. That has not changed at all. To be the fourth landfall we've had this season, which would be a new record for us for a single season. All right, we're answering your questions tonight as well, folks. Don't forget, you can send them on Twitter. Use the hashtag Hurricane Questions. This question, how do you measure the direction a hurricane is likely to take? Basically what we're looking for, and thank you for your question, basically what we're looking for is, what's the atmosphere around the hurricane? What's pushing it? What's pulling it? What's steering it? And you could take a look at the more or less the mid and upper level weather pattern. That's what's going to push this along. And what we've been looking at is a fairly strong high-pressure system, more or less the Bermuda High, that shifted its way a little bit more toward Florida. And what that will do, and you consider the counterclockwise flow that goes around that, okay? Or the clockwise flow, I should say, that goes around that. What you end up seeing here, folks, is winds that end up pushing this off to the west. And that's why we've seen more of a west or northwest movement here over the course of the last 2 days here. But eventually that high begins to break down and shift a little bit more to the east here. And we're going to start to see a trough build in here around the Gulf of Mexico. It says that high pressure then begins to weaken and pull back a little bit. That gives this hurricane a little bit more of an avenue to go north a little bit more now, all right? And so as that happens, then you're going to see it interact with more of an upper level trough that digs in now across, say, Texas, going into Thursday into Friday. Now, what that does is the hurricane kind of catches a ride on that. Can't really go this direction because it's going to butt up into the jet stream. Can't really go in this direction, so it's kind of going to follow more or less along it. And this is why we think the steering more or less takes it off to the northeast near landfall and then beyond. So this is what the cone is doing. Again, initial push to the west from high pressure. High pressure relaxes a bit. It starts to pull a little bit more to the north. Trough pulls in, and now it starts to pull its way off to the north and east. So in essence, we're looking at the atmosphere around it to see where it's going. USGFS model track goes right down the center of the hurricane cone right now. The GFS has been a very good hurricane model this year, and all the ensemble members are within the cone at this point. And basically look at all the other computer models. Also, almost every single one of them within the cone. European model next 10 days, very similar. And then once it makes landfall, that widens a bit, but always there's more air the farther out in the forecast you go here, Alex. But I would say if you're in the southern Mississippi River Valley, big impacts coming your way, potentially even up through the Mid-South and even the Ohio Valley through the weekend and beyond.
Yeah, this thing's moving, so we could get some stronger winds well inland with this. We look at the alert. Storm surge watches also posted along the coast. So once again, we've got another round of that storm surge threat from parts of extreme East Texas all the way over towards Mobile into Alabama. So we're looking at coastal Louisiana, coastal Mississippi, parts of Alabama and Texas. Storm surge potential. This is the greatest potential. Not everybody's going to get these storm surge values, but the potential is there for 7 to 11 feet of storm surge there through portions of south central, southeastern Louisiana. Closer to the east-facing shores, just off to the southeast of New Orleans. 4 to 6 feet would be located in a few spots, and then the 2 to 4 feet from Biloxi to Mobile, also Cameron over to near Galveston. So portions of Texas could see that water rise as well. Surge-prone areas here along the central Gulf Coast. They're numerous. This is a part of the country that is especially susceptible to surge because we've got that shallow shelf. So shallow shelf in the Gulf means that we get that stronger push up onto the normally dry land, and we can see some really incredible totals. When you've got a deeper shelf, you see less drastic of surge. Now, larger storms in total area, Dr. Knabb was talking to us about this last night, they're also going to produce higher surge because we've got a larger wind field. So we're going to see that push of water over a larger area as that wind pushes on the larger area, and also the stronger winds affect spots for a longer period of time, because again, we're not talking about a small storm moving, but we're talking about a very expansive storm. So areas stay in that zone of strong winds longer. Find out now if you're in an evacuation zone. If you're told to do so, go. Mike, so many times it is the surge that causes the losses of property and people in storms.
We think there are a lot of vulnerable locations there in southern Louisiana. One of them could be Houma, Louisiana, where you can see that it's a beautiful day today. We've got traffic backed up the lights here, but hopefully you are getting your hurricane preparations underway and hopefully completed soon. But we could be at risk here in a place like Houma, and maybe even at the current track, a right front quadrant hit, which would mean that you'd have the most potential for wind there. Now, Houma sits a little bit off the water here, but we can still see water come into Houma. There's a look at the track. Zoomed in now. Louisiana, again, the most likely target here. If you remember with Hurricane Laura came in this direction like this and hammered us in Cameron. This is going to take, if you follow the center track, more in this direction. But what that would still do is put the landfall, most likely, if you go down the center track here, somewhere between probably Cameron and Pecan Island here, maybe as a Category 2 hurricane. Right now, forecast is 105 mile per hour near landfall. So This is what we need to be preparing for. We need to be preparing for winds of over 100 miles an hour at a landfall. When do the tropical storm force winds begin? We think that begins as early as Friday morning, with things ramping up quickly throughout the day. Now, the tropical storm force winds extend out about 125 miles from the center. That's the yellow that you see on your map here. There's a smaller hurricane force wind field, but you see the tropical storm force wind field expands, the hurricane force wind field expands, and then as it comes in and makes a landfall here, the most likely area again, probably maybe at this point with center cone just east of Cameron. Strong surge on the right front quadrant side, which could also mean issues at Pontchartrain. Strong winds extending well outside of that cone, by the way, which could be over into New Orleans, which could be as far west as Houston and Galveston. So as we urge people, Alex, to watch the cone, but don't focus on exactly the cone because the impacts are far beyond that.
Absolutely. Don't think inside problem, outside not a problem. It's not that simple. City officials began closing the seawalls today in Morgan City, Louisiana. That's where we find our own Mike Seidel.
This is the Atchafalaya River here in Morgan City, Louisiana, and it is going to come up for sure with that surge forecast. Delta making its approach and landfalling likely south and west of here sometime later Friday. The water comes up. Now, they are dredging the river. They do this all the time to keep the harbor nice and deep for navigation and for shipping. But I want to show you the saving grace here in Morgan City. Look at this monster seawall. They doubled the height of this back in the 1980s. This was completed in 1985 at 22 feet. And look at this giant door, this gate. This morning we're here. Look at this. This is how they close it. It's pretty simple. They just attach a chain to a piece of heavy equipment and they just pull it closed. They've got about 40 of these to close up ahead of Hurricane Delta. But we talked to city officials and they're not overly concerned because of where the water level sits right now on the Atchafalaya River.
Hurricane Barry just last year, this river was already at 7, meaning we would be standing this deep in water right now and then put a storm surge on top of that. Now we've got easily 3 feet before it gets to the top of the bank, so we've got a little more capacity to handle that, so that puts us a little bit at ease. Unfortunately for the people that are on the unprotected side of the river here, they're just going to get subject to flooding.
And thankfully the river is down. Their biggest concern here, we talked to the mayor and other city officials, the wind, worried about structural damage, and by Mike Seidel, the Weather Channel, Morgan City, Louisiana.
And then, of course, we've got the rain to contend with out of this, and that could extend well inland as well into areas that have seen a ton of rain this year. Take a look at the footprint from the European model. This has the majority of that rain coming down into the state of Louisiana and Arkansas. How about 8 to 12 inches from Lake Charles up to Alexandria and all the way to near Memphis? We could see 5 to 8 inch totals, so spots getting a half foot or more possibly. USGFS, fairly similar, a little farther to the east. Now we get into parts of western Mississippi with that heaviest area of rainfall. 5 to 8 inch totals, again, could be working right up along the Mississippi River to the northern parts of the state of Mississippi. Let's take a look at the forecast here moving forward. By later tomorrow, we're going to see the winds pick up. We're going to see the rain move in. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you can see some heavier downpours possible according to the European model, but the bulk of the rain and expected landfall coming during the day on Friday. So Friday afternoon into Saturday morning, that's when the rain will be heaviest across the state of Louisiana. Saturday into the early afternoon, I think still some heavy rainfall. You can see as the storm weakens through Saturday evening, could still see some heavy downpours into parts of West Tennessee, Kentucky, Mike, even getting up into the Ohio Valley.
We're watching all the way through landfall and beyond, Alex. Thank you. Coming up on Weather Underground, our coverage of Delta continues. Its next target, the U.S. Gulf Coast. We're going to take you back live to the coast where preparations for yet another strike are well underway as states like Louisiana brace for impact.
A woman. Your cameras roll. Our experts react.
Jaw-dropping.
Weather Gone Viral. Sunday nights at 9 here on the Weather Channel. season doesn't stop for a pandemic, and neither do we.
From this point forward, conditions will continue to deteriorate.
Don't let COVID-19 take your eye off the tropics. This year's threat is more complex and dangerous than ever before.
Remain vigilant, pay close attention to the Weather Channel.
No one can cover this historic hurricane season better than the Weather Channel. Get the information you need to stay safe every day. Storm safety in a pandemic, all season long, right here on the Weather Channel.
Welcome back to Weather Underground. I'm meteorologist Paul Goodlow live in New Orleans, Louisiana. So for the 6th time so far this hurricane season, New Orleans has been in the cone of an approaching hurricane. The good news is we're now just to the east of that cone, and a lot of people are happy to hear that, but they know we'll still have impacts. To the right of me, this is the Mississippi River here. And then on the other side of New Orleans, you have Lake Pontchartrain. So kind of sitting between two pretty impressive bodies of water here. And the big concern is as the storm makes landfall, we'll still see a more of an easterly wind, which means we're going to have water from this river pushing on this part of the lakefront here. So coastal flooding, even river flooding is a possibility, as well as lake flooding is definitely a concern. Our winds, we do expect them to probably gust to and even above tropical storm force for much of the day as you head really Friday night into Saturday morning. But we do think the strongest of impacts will still be well to the west of New Orleans. As that track has shifted farther west, the impacts have been reduced substantially here in New Orleans, which is definitely a big concern because we are physically below sea level because we're walled off from the river and from the lake here. So things have been slowly subsiding over the numerous years we've been kind of protected by flooding here. But the bad news is we're still going to have some impacts. And something that we're going to be concerned about until this system moves on off. But I tell you what, the impacts we'll see here will be nothing compared to the impacts a lot of people saw in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico as Delta made its first landfall there, Alex, I guess earlier, this morning / last night.
Yeah, so we've seen one landfall. The positive is, gosh, it was not nearly as bad as it could have been. The storm weakened into the evening, allowing the Yucatan to escape landfall of a major hurricane. You are looking at video from Playa del Carmen, officially making landfall, by the way, 110-mile-per-hour winds. That's a Category 2 storm there over the Yucatan. So bad, but not as bad. Remember, this time yesterday, we were tracking a Category 4 hurricane. Some wind shear, some weakening at the last second really helped them. Now, getting a sense of some of the damage. Of course, you're dealing with a Category 2 hurricane. You're going to have damage. Here in Cancun, wind gusts of 106 miles per hour, strong enough to take down some trees. You can see some of that water working its way onto the roadways. So problems, but again, we managed to mitigate some of those problems. Now we watch the next step, of course, as this makes its way into the Gulf of Mexico. But near Puerto Morelos, Mexico, is where this made landfall, Category 2. So we did not get that major hurricane landfall that we were forecast to be the first since back in 2005. So, hey, we'll take it, right? 110-mile-per-hour winds, still a potent storm, and again, barely a Category 2, just on the cusp of Category 3. Pressure 972 millibars. We look at the enhanced satellite picture, and again, at the last second, some of that wind shear helped to knock it down in intensity a bit as it made its way closer to Cozumel. We were looking at Cancun, some of those north-facing shores to see some of the worst, actually, of the surge. Sustained winds there in Cancun, 84 miles an hour, wind gusts over 100 miles an hour. I mentioned that one. That minimum pressure made it down to 972 millibars. And then we've seen even some more dropping of the wind speed and increasing of the pressure. So some weakening, but now this is going to get out over the Gulf of Mexico. So once again, we'll be looking at strengthening. Mike does not add to this list now of major hurricanes near Cancun. Yeah. Just missed it. But again, this is one that you like the miss.
Yeah, we're okay with that. You know, weakening storm, in our opinion, always a good one, right? We know that a lot of you are concerned about the timing. When's it coming to my city? Well, let's break it down for you in a place like Lake Charles, Louisiana. I know you're still recovering from the hard hit you took from Hurricane Laura. We feel for you folks, but by Friday morning, you could be looking at 60+ mile-per-hour gusts here. Things could get very significant on Friday where you might see, you know, Category 1 or even 2 hurricane force gusts. We think that rain to come is about 5 to 8 inches of rain. That might cause some localized flooding. There's no question about that. But from Lake Charles to Lafayette here up towards, say, Alexandria, expect roughly a half foot of rain to come your way. And then as it pulls farther inland, starts to weaken, the numbers come down a little bit. But Lafayette here, 60-plus mile-per-hour winds begin force Friday evening. And then the rainfall here in Lafayette, about 3 to 5 inches of rain is likely to come for you. Also, that could cause some localized flooding. As far as the rainfall goes, from maybe a Gulfport to a Mobile, over toward Pensacola, a 1 to 2 inch rainfall for you. You're significantly farther east of the landfall location. And then let's go west, 1 to 2 inches then for Galveston and Houston metro, with more significant amounts in a place like Beaumont and Port Arthur. Alex?
Still to come on the show tonight, we're answering your questions about Hurricane Delta. Just go on Twitter, use the hashtag Hurricane Questions, and we'll be answering them throughout the show. And much more on the potential track of Hurricane Delta. We'll break down the latest forecast models and what the Gulf Coast can expect.